I am honored to once again play a part in the NSPU Department of Psychology and Inclusive Education Conference on Inclusive Education. I regret that health concerns mean that I cannot be with you in person. Over the past few years, I have gained many friends and learned much from my association with NSPU. Today I will give an overview of the growth of leadership in inclusive education, the leadership of the United Nations, of a leading Canadian organization, the Marsha Forest Center, of President Putin, of the Russian national organization Perspectiva, and of the present and emerging leaders. I do not claim to have extensive knowledge of the Russian education system. My comments are based only on my glimpses during various visits. The outcome is that the majority of governments and educators have been slow to recognize the values of inclusive education. The United Nations and its associated bodies, however, leave no doubt regarding preference for inclusive education over special education. It is not that special education has not served a purpose over past years. I worked in special education for 15 years as a classroom teacher and administrator, and then as a university professor. I was proud of my work. However, time and knowledge move on, and some people have moved on with it. Unfortunately, many of those using the term inclusive education at present do not realize that inclusive education is based on a completely different concept than is special education. The special education is based on segregation of students with disabilities from their non-disabled peers. Inclusive education is based on all students, no matter what differences exist among them, learning together in the same classrooms of regular schools in keeping with social justice and human and student rights. If a school has a plan to include all students over time, I would consider that to be a school working toward inclusive education. If there is no plan for change to begin with, I would question the school's commitment to inclusive education. Visionary leaders understand the past contributions special education has made. However, they also realize that new lessons have been learned and more progressive, socially just policies initiated. They also know they need to have a plan for the future and are actively working toward it. They have realized that inclusive education policies are proving more effective for learners with disabilities in both academic and social spheres than has special education. This new approach to education also benefits students without disabilities, particularly in the social sphere. Salamanca Statement, 1994. In 1994, a meeting of experts in education and disabilities met in Salamanca, Spain, under the aegis of UNESCO, an agency of the United Nations, to discuss education for those with disabilities. The meeting resulted in a policy statement recommending change to inclusive education. The statement reads, "We believe and proclaim that every child has a fundamental right to education, and must be given the opportunity to achieve and maintain an acceptable level of learning. Education systems should be designed and educational programs implemented to take into account the wide diversity and needs. Those with special educational needs must have access to regular schools with a child-centered pedagogy capable of meeting their needs. Regular schools with this inclusive orientation are the most effective means of combating discriminatory attitudes, creating welcoming communities, building an inclusive society, and achieving education for all. Moreover, they provide an effective solution to the majority of children and prove efficiency and ultimately the cost effectiveness of the entire school system. In 2002, the United Nations emphasized the same message in Article 24, Education, of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Examples of notable leadership. Marcia Fora Center. It was not UNESCO or the UN who conceived inclusive education as meeting the needs of all students and that all should be educated together. In July 1988, 6 years before the term was used at the Salamanca meeting, it was introduced at a meeting in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, of Canadian and American parents, persons with disabilities, and advocates. These leaders were concerned that the special education model was too slow in meeting the needs of persons with disabilities. Someone suggested that the term inclusion was stronger and more comprehensive than those used in the segregation-based special education model. It was a term that could be applied to all persons with disabilities and that emphasized that everyone has the same rights, regardless of difference. This was the beginning of inclusive education. Perspectiva. As far as I know, Perspectiva was an early advocate of inclusive education in Russia. Denise Rosa is an American who moved to Russia and has now lived there for many years. She built Perspective as an inclusive organization with a staff of people with disabilities and also people without disabilities. Perspectiva was the earliest education organization working to advance inclusive education in the nation. Its focus was inclusion. President Putin. The G8 2006 meeting was held in St. Petersburg, Russia, under the leadership of President Putin. In preparation for the meeting, many international committees met in Moscow to develop recommendations in various aspects of society for President Putin to take forward to the G8 meetings. One of these international committees was focused on education and disabilities. Denise Rosa of the Russian organization Perspectiva and I, among others, sat on this committee. Following much discussion whether to retain the special education model or move to inclusive education, the committee recommended inclusive education. When President Putin, at a meeting of the various civil society committees received the recommendation for inclusion, he immediately accepted it. One of the Canadian committee members asked President Putin if she could approach for the committee and asked if he would accept a pin designed by Perspectiva for all to see. This was the reaction of a visionary leader in regard to inclusive education. It then became the responsibility of others in Russia to continue moving forward. Shortly after the G8 meeting, I noticed a marked increase in Russian universities offering programs on inclusive education. It seems to me, though I cannot be certain, that the two, President Putin's ready acceptance of inclusive education and the activity among the universities, might be linked. All of you have spent many years in classrooms surrounded by other learners. All of you must be successful learners who have developed interest in inclusive education, or you would not be sitting in this classroom. Among you are the leaders who will change education for persons with disabilities. At the same time, you and your work will be making an impact on society. I have presented a quick overview of the history of inclusive education with particular note of leadership in Russia. I will continue reference to your nation and what has formed my positive impression of progress in inclusive education. On my first visit to Russia, I worked with Perspectiva. I became familiar with Denise Rosa, leader of Perspectiva, when she participated some years ago in the Marsha Forest Center annual Summer Institute on Inclusion. She was accompanied by a young woman lawyer who happened to be blind. Shortly following the Summer Institute, Denise invited me to visit Russia and learn about Perspectiva's work. I had the privilege of seeing inclusive education in various parts of your nation. On my first trip, I visited a Moscow school. The first class I entered had students about 8 years of age. The classroom was similar to those in Canada. The class was in the middle of a lesson. Glancing about, I saw one young boy with the characteristics of Down's syndrome. There was a woman sitting beside him and giving him support as was needed. The child was participating fully in the lesson. The woman seemed to be what we in Canada refer to as an educational assistant. At lunch, a teacher asked me if I had noticed the boy. I said, yes, I did. The teacher said, that is Boris Yeltsin's grandson. I also visited a school in Ulan-Ude, where I was welcomed in a number of classrooms. I noticed some lessons with disabilities taking part in lessons with the other young students. Some had educational assistants, while others did not. I also met a secondary school student in the hallway and was introduced to him. Our chat was interesting as he told me about his academic work and his relationships with other students. The school administrator had no need to translate for me. The young man's English was far beyond my few words of Russian. It was obvious in both schools that all students, those with disabilities and without disabilities, got along well, had friends, and were successful and happy in school. It was obvious as well that the staff was comfortable with students with disabilities, and that they were responsible for the learning of all students. The school leadership was effective. I have visited and worked in a number of nations, but only in a few have I seen the quality of inclusive education that I have seen in Russia. In my visits to Russia prior to the G8 meeting, I had met with professors and discussed inclusive education with them. They dismissed the idea of inclusive education. Others, in other parts of Russia, may have preferred inclusive education, but those I met at that time did not. This is no longer the case as can be seen here at NSPU and its conference. I certainly have been impressed by the leadership of NSPU and the speakers at its conferences. They certainly give a significant boost to inclusive education. Day-to-day leaders. The day-to-day leaders are among those working to advance inclusive education at the university and school system level. They are the people without whom progress cannot be made. These people are sitting in this classroom today. They are the future of inclusive education. They are the professors who teach the future teachers and who undertake research necessary to improve knowledge and to lay the base for the future. They are the administrators in school systems who manage and support progress across a number of schools. They are the school principals who work daily to lead and support inclusive education. They are the present and future classroom teachers who develop and teach lessons to all students and stimulate mutual acceptance among students. There are others who in various ways support the movement of inclusive education. Final thoughts. Inclusive education cannot occur overnight. It takes time to prepare education to change its viewpoint in such a fundamental way. Very few of us experienced inclusive education when we were young. I certainly did not. In my view, to be successful, leaders of education must create a plan for incremental change. There must be a timeline to guide the change over time. There must be a final objective of achieving inclusive education. Here in Canada, every province and territory states that they are doing inclusive education. Their plans for change appear in their policy statements. Some have firm policies and guidelines. Others have policies which are less firm and who leave loopholes which give educators opportunity to avoid inclusive education. Do you think the following statement policy from a Canadian province is firm about inclusive education for all? Or are there loopholes which allow the continuance of the special education model? I believe that one needs to examine the policy statements of educational jurisdictions on education and disability to discover whether a particular jurisdiction is serious about bringing all students together in the same classrooms of schools. Here is one such policy statement from one Canadian jurisdiction. Inclusion is a value system which holds that all students are entitled equitable access to learning, achievement, and the pursuit of excellence for all in all aspects of their education. The practice of inclusion transcends the idea of physical location and incorporates the basic values that promote participation, friendship, and interaction.
Okay.
The principle of placement in the most enabling environment applies when decisions are made in schools about the extent to which an individual student is placed in a regular classroom or assigned to an alternative placement. Is this Canadian jurisdiction serious about including all students? I will leave that to you to ponder. I am not familiar enough with the Russian system to comment. But you might wish to read through any applicable policies in your area of Russia. Are there any loopholes which may result in the continuance of the special education model? Thank you for your invitation to join in the NSPU 2016 conference. I hope this overview of the growth of inclusive education has been of interest. Thank you. I wish you a successful conference.